Hi everyone. Today's lecture is on the forces of evolution. So I've got the PowerPoint up next to me. Feel free to follow along or look at it later. It's up to you. Just like before, I'm going to hit on the major points. Some of the bullet points are self-explanatory. Some of them I want to make sure you're understanding. So like the third slide in, you will see Captain Picard. So hopefully it's not too dated of a reference. And you will see he's saying this is so simple, understanding the definition of evolution. Now, it's going to get a little more intricate and involved later, but the definition itself of biological evolution is very simple. It is a change in allele frequency in a population over time. Now you might be thinking, well, okay, I think we talked about alleles in another video, population. Okay, so basically, an even more simple way of saying this would be to say a change in genetic information in a population as time goes on. So that's very simple, right? But you're probably already thinking there are probably different ways that can happen, and you are correct. There are 5 ways, 5 different ways that you can get a change in allele frequency in a population over time. And we're going to talk about those 5. That's why this lecture is called The Forces of Evolution. There are 5 forces. There are 5 ways that a change in genetic information over time can occur. Usually the one people think of is like natural selection. That's one of the 5. But before we break into that, you'll see there is the next slide, which shows how we as scientists, the approach we take to really examining a lot of this. Now, in the other lecture on like science and positivism, we definitely talked about that, right? That in science we're not evaluating things based on a value judgment. Is this better or worse, good or bad? That's all very subjective, anecdotal. That's not a scientific question, right? That could be a question you ask in your personal life. It could be maybe if you're a spiritual, religious person, that could be a question you ask in that context. But in science, we're not looking at something is better or worse. That's not something you would even ask. That's not what we're doing with science. We're trying to find factual information, not subjective, not opinion. And the goal is, we're human, we get it wrong sometimes, right? But science is always arcing in the direction of fact and truth. Okay, so you'll see the slide. It has, this guy, he's sitting on the top of a little ladder, and it says wrong, right? And then where he's kind of a branch on a tree, it says right. So this is how we would look at things scientifically, that there's no value judgment or examination or evaluation on whether something is better or worse than something else. Now, you as a person in the world might think, well, I'm better than a rabbit or a bug, whatever. You can have that opinion, obviously. Like, you can have whatever opinion you want. Totally fine. But as a scientist, we would never structure things like that or even ask questions like that. When we're looking at, let's say, like all of nature, plants, animals, whatever, it would look like the image on the right. Like, oh, here are just different branches of a tree of life. There's no value judgment placed on if a certain branch is better or worse or good or bad or anything like that at all, right? So that's the kind of the perspective we're coming out. Some other important things about evolution in general, because often students will be a little confused. Sometimes I feel like students get some of this info in high school, but I didn't attend high school in Clark County, so I can't really speak to it, personally, but I've heard mixed things, so I'm just going to assume maybe some of this wasn't explained. So the first bullet point on this next slide, and the title says, evolution has no goal. So if, when you're reflecting back on this class in, 10 years, you're like, oh, I remember that 102 I took. What do I remember from that class? As we go through this semester, as you watch these lectures, I will point out, like, this is one of those things. I'll probably say it about a handful of things, but I usually say if there are only, 3 things you remember, this should be one of them. And this is probably on that short list. Evolution has no goal. There is not like Mother Nature or the spirit of nature out there saying, you're going to grow another limb, you're going to get wings, you're going to learn to go from the ocean to the land. Like, then none of that's happening. Something's not guiding it in that way. There's no goal there's no goal that eventually every animal's going to be on land and not in the ocean. There's no goal that all quadrupedal animals, so those on all fours, will eventually walk on two. There's no goal to that. We are one of the handful of animals that have ever existed that, are bipedal. We're not the only ones. Obviously, there's been, a lot. But when we're looking at nature now, we could say, oh, look at primates. Most of them are quadrupedal. And then, there's humans who are bipedal, right? Any snapshot in, the deep time of history, you're going to see, variation, of course. But so there's no goal towards any of that. There's not even a goal to be faster or bigger. We see plenty of animals, depending on the environment, of course, who are really successful because they're slow or because they can hide well, because they're small. Like, you know what I mean? So it's never, ever about being bigger, better, faster. That's an incorrect way of thinking of it. There's no goal towards any of that. Evolution is just the result of whatever genetics are involved and whatever environment's involved in the interaction between them. That's really it, which we're going to get into more detail in a second. So you see that the next bullet points of evolution is not working towards a goal. Evolution does not represent a hierarchy. There's no hierarchy. You could have an opinion as a person in the world. You think, this thing's better than this thing. Like, oh, I think dogs are better than, beetles, whatever. You can have that opinion, but in science, we would never organize it that way. No. There are no value judgments. All animals are not trying to become human. It's very arrogant. I've heard that from maybe a couple students. It's usually rare for students to think that, but I've definitely heard that before. Or I had a student one time tell me, they came to class one day and like, I told my parents I was telling them what we were learning in class. So I was like, oh, cool, And they're like, and they said that you were wrong. And I'm like, well, I have the degree. I've been doing this with my life for, probably 2 decades at this point. So I'm not wrong. And this is like introductory information, right? This is like the basics of the basics, so none of this is controversial at all. So animals aren't trying to become human. An animal that is alive now is not trying to become any other animal that's alive now or the past or the future. That's not how it's working, right? So, I had one student ask me one time, well, won't chimps evolve into humans? And I was like, no, nothing is going to evolve into a Homo sapien. We're already here. We already exist. Let's say in the chimpanzee lineage, let's say they don't die out, and for whatever environmental pressure is acting on the evolution of that group, that they start to walk upright, something changes in their environment and that ends up being a little more beneficial. And let's say even their brains get a bit bigger. They're already pretty smart, right? But let's say their brains even get a little bigger. They wouldn't be Homo sapiens, right? They would be pan something else, right? Plenty of animals have similar adaptations. Like, look at all the quadrupedal animals. You could say there's a quadruped animal on all fours, right, with a tail and long ears that could describe a bunch of different animals. It doesn't mean one of them was trying to evolve into the other. Like, that's not how it works at all. Nothing is trying to become a human or anything else, right? We're not trying to become something else that's already existing. That makes no sense. So that's not happening. So in case you had maybe confusion on that, none of that's accurate. So the next slide, here it lists the 5 forces of evolution. So I made that meme. It's very accurate. Anthropologists are known to be very, well, scientists in general, but I think anthropologists among scientists are kind of known to be very expressive and, what's the word? Like, we're just very excitable, I think, when we're talking about our work and stuff. We think we're having these, like, conversations like, oh, yeah, Charles Darwin. And then we're really like, oh my God, So it's kind of funny. But these are the 5 forces. So natural selection, which is one you probably have heard of. We'll talk about that in some more detail. The next 4 are mutation, gene flow, genetic drift, and then non-random mating. Non-random mating is also known as sexual selection. So either of those terms is fine. So we're going to start jumping into these. So let's see. In the lecture on like the who's who in like, or pre-Darwin, and I had talked a little bit about Darwin's idea of natural selection, so you've already kind of got an introduction to that. So some of this might be a little bit of review, but it's fine. So the premises built into Darwin's idea before he and Wallace kind of fully developed the idea, there were certain like assumptions built into this that are true in nature. So here you can see the list of them on this slide 7. Resources are finite is number 1. We don't have an infinite amount of resources on this planet. There is a finite amount, and competition exists in nature. You could be an herbivore competing with another herbivore for a certain type of plant that you both like. You could be a carnivore, trying to catch its prey. You could be the prey trying to avoid the predator. You know what I mean? Competition is always existing in nature. And then the third bullet point is that variation exists. So you can look, let's say you're sitting at a coffee shop right now, listening to this lecture. Look around, you're going to see people of different ages, different heights, different, skin tone, different hair length, different nose shape, like anything and everything, right? Behaviorally, some are going to be maybe, if you're like, everyone, let's do a race together. Some people are going to be slower, some people are going to be faster, right? There's variation to every trait, behavioral and physical. With those 3 things combined, you get a scenario where, because competition exists, certain traits, depending on the environment, are going to be more beneficial. Some might be less beneficial. So those individuals who have those traits that might be more beneficial, depending on the environment, are going to be much more likely to survive, thrive, and reproduce. That could be something that only gives them, a 2% advantage, but over enough time, you're going to see that shift. So the example I use over and over again, because it's a very good example, is imagine there was a very snowy, wintry environment. It's very snowy and white. It's very cold. Let's say a small population of bunnies starts to migrate into that area. Some are white, some are very dark gray, and some maybe are like a brown in the middle. Very quickly, probably over the course of just a handful of generations, you're going to see, just based on that one trait, just coloring. Now, there are, we could talk about a list of 1,000 traits that bunnies would have, every single little minuscule trait, right? But even if we're looking at just that one trait, just the color of the fur, we can already probably tell, based on our general knowledge, which of those 3 is going to do better in that environment, right? Based on just that one trait. It is the ones who can blend in a little better, right? Predators aren't going to necessarily see the white bunnies against the white snow, not nearly as obviously as they're going to see like the black or the dark gray and the brown bunnies against the white snow, right? Then start factoring in other features like the amount of fat they have on them. Obviously, if it's a very cold environment, the ones who have a little bit more fat probably going to do a little bit better, right? So over time, you're going to see bunnies in that population where it used to be maybe they had different levels of fat on them, they were different sizes, they were different colors. Over enough time, you're going to see then that population of bunnies go to mostly lighter color, mostly with a bit more fat on them, right? Like in terms of the natural selection process. So, I mean, that's, like I said, I use that example a lot because it's a good example, it's like a classic example, and it's a very good visual example. So if you can kind of remember that example, that's like the perfect way to understand the general idea of natural selection. And just on the next slide, there's a picture of Darwin, and it's kind of putting this all together, like I just said, Let's see. Slide 9. This is very important. You may have incorrectly heard this expression, and in fact, if you are like watching a TV show or a movie and they use this expression, I have never heard it used correctly. It is almost always used incorrectly. This term survival of the fittest is usually used in a reference to like, oh, you have to be bigger or faster. Like none of that's accurate, right? Or you have to be tougher, or like that's not what that means. In fact, it doesn't have anything to do with the particular trait, which people get that part wrong all the time. Survival of the fittest is a direct reference to a concept called fitness. Evolutionary fitness, very simply, is the number of offspring you have. Like how successfully have you produced genetic information into the next generation? That is your measure of evolutionary fitness. So if you have like 3 offspring, someone else has 1 offspring, you are more evolutionarily fit. It is not a value judgment of your physical traits or behavioral traits. It's unrelated to that at all. It is only a measure of how much genetic information you have passed into the next generation. That's it. That's all it is. So when we say survival of the fittest, it's really kind of a shortened way of saying survival of the people with the most offspring, because they have successfully passed their genes into the next generation. It's the survival of their genes, survival of the fittest. That's what it's a reference to. It's not a reference to a trait or being fast or big. That's totally wrong. Also, Charles Darwin is not the one who said that. It was a man, one of his colleagues named Herbert Spencer. Yeah, so now you know. Let's see. And then the next slide, slide 10 is, I'm sorry, slide 10? Yeah. Wait, what's going on with my PowerPoint? Okay. Is also very, very, very important. You may have heard before the expression, you don't have to be faster than the bear. You just have to be faster than the person running next to you. You just can't be in last place. Basically, if you're running with other people and you're all running away from a bear, as long as you're not in last place, you're successful, right? Because the bear's going to get the person at the end, the first one that comes across. So remembering that expression is the perfect way of understanding how natural selection works. Natural selection is not about refining a trait to be perfectly suited for its environment. It's not like the most perfect, pristine outcome you can get. It's not like you're like, oh, this like glowing, angelic feature that is perfect in every way. That's not how it works. Natural selection is always, does this version of this trait, whatever kind of changes happen, does this work a little bit better? It could be a lot better. It could even be just a little bit better. Does this thing work better than the other thing that we had before? Maybe the environment has shifted slightly. Maybe it got a little warmer or a little colder, or etc. And so certain physical traits or physical behaviors had to slightly adjust to that, to be more successful. Like, those who had those traits did better, essentially. It's never about, oh, their trait is not perfect for the environment. It's usually the trait is just working a little bit better. So a really good example that most of you can identify with is the fact that we are bipedal. So we, as humans, as primates, we walk on 2 limbs rather than 4. There are pros and cons to being a quadruped or being a biped. One of the obvious ones students usually are aware of is that quadrupeds can run very, very fast, but they can't go very far. But bipeds, we can't go very fast, but we can go very far. So of course, depending on the environment you're in, one of those might end up being a little more beneficial than the other. And so we see, that shifting. But so we have been bipedal in our lineage for about 7 million years, maybe just shy of 7 million years, a long time, and not without its problems, which I talk about in another lecture. Most of you, if you reach a certain age, not because of an injury, not because of a disease, but simply because we are bipedal and all of our body weight is on 2 limbs rather than distributed amongst 4. Most of us will have a problem, or multiple, with our feet, our back, our hips. Like, it's all of it, right? Simply because we're bipedal. So it's not as if being bipedal is suddenly the most perfect locomotion. It is definitely not. In fact, anyone can make the case that being a quadruped is the best. Like, there's pros and cons. Pros and cons to any behavior, any trait. There's just pros and cons, right? It depends on what's going on in the environment, when that particular trait adapted, or developed. So we have this trait of being bipedal, and it's lasted for millions and millions of years in our lineage. But even after 7 million years, most of us will develop a problem with our body simply because of that fact, not because of a disease or injury, but simply because we're bipedal. So there's never a trait that's perfect. There are always pros and cons to it. So I've got a quote on one of the slides. You can read that. And then I have some images you'll see. So a really good example, like I mentioned before, is the white bunny against the snow. You'll also see, this is slide 12, you'll also see the desert hare in contrast. So also really well adapted to its environment. It has less body fat because it's hot, doesn't need to store, keep itself warm or insulated. The limbs, including even the ears, are extended. They're very long. This actually allows you to be able to dissipate the heat better. And then, of course, as shades of brown to blend in with the environment. So depending on the environment, certain traits are going to be more beneficial or not. So the desert hare in the desert, the features of it being elongated, less, body fat, the brown color, really well suited for the desert. Put it in the snow environment, though, not suited at all, right? In every way. So It's never just about looking at the genetics or the behavior or the trait. It's looking about its relationship with the environment. There's another slide on slide 13 just showing some really cool like big cats and how they are really well blended in with their environment. So another feature of natural selection. And then slide 14, I go into something called pareidolia. Pareidolia is very interesting. Most of us have experienced pareidolia a little bit. So you've like looked in the clouds and you're like, that looks like a cat, or something like that. So we as humans, we're not the only ones, but let's talk about us for a second. We have the ability to see faces, typically faces, right? When there isn't really a face there. So you can see I've got some images there, and it looks like someone's cut the bell pepper open. It looks like a smiling face. The person's luggage looks like a frowny face. It looks like there's kind of a weird face in the cliffside. We do this a lot. Now there is, I didn't think I had to pull this out, but pull out the whiteboard real quick. In life, in nature, not always, but a lot of times, when you're looking at a trait or a behavior, a lot of times these can fall on what's called the normal distribution. So if you were looking at, let's say in this case, we're talking about pareidolia. Some people have the ability, they see faces and things all the time. Some people might see it a little more or a little less. It's because any trait, behavioral, mental, physical, whatever, typically, not always, but typically falls in something called the normal distribution. So it would look something like this. Let's say we're looking at a graph, right? You probably have seen representations like this before. Hello. Where you're like, okay, the average amount of people have the trait, let me see. Like the average, let's say we're talking about pareidolia. The average human experiences this, not a problem. You might have some people over here on this side of the bell curve that experience it a little more. They're like, oh, they see faces or patterns in everything, right? And you might have some people over here, that maybe don't see it as often. So if you're like, oh, I see it more than my friend or vice versa, that's just because there's always variation to everything, right? I lost my train of thought. So, but most humans have the ability to, see faces and patterns. That is because most of the time it's neutral. Most of the time it's a silly little thing you point out to someone. It's not really beneficial to you, like in terms of like natural selection. It's just, oh, I have this ability. That is because we're really good at doing it a lot. That is because in the past, it would have been vital to be able to see faces, in things. We have the ability now, we see it all the time, and it usually doesn't really matter because in the past, and even in certain current environments now, depending on where you live, if you do see it, it's really important, because if you don't, it could be life or death. So I've got some examples. If you go down a few slides, I've got other like pareidolia examples, but if you go down to slide 19 and 20, you will see two examples. Now take a minute, you might even have to like zoom in, take a minute to see if you can find the face. When I first picked these, I'm like, did I pick the wrong image? Are these even right? I don't see the face. And then you can't unsee it, So like I said, I think it's slide 19 and 20. Take a moment and look at those and see if you can find the face. And so this is the point of pareidolia, is we see faces in everything because in the past, and even sometimes now, you want to be able to see it when it's actually there, when it actually matters, because if there's a large animal, a predator, it's going to be beneficial for you to be able to kind of see faces and things that are tricky, kind of tricky to see. Okay. And then on 21, you get another really good visual of the natural selection process. So you see, we're looking at birds and bugs, right? We've got a predator and prey. The birds are eating the green bugs. There's a mixture of green bugs and orange bugs. For whatever reason, the birds love the green bugs. Maybe they taste better, whatever. They're like, yes, the green bugs are favorite. So in this population, that looks to be about, 70% green bugs and 30% orange bugs. The birds are eating mostly the green. So after a few generations, you kind of see, as this image goes, that now there is more of an even split of green bugs to orange bugs. Very likely the orange bugs who were not being eaten, at least not nearly as often, were more likely to survive, thrive, and reproduce more. So as generations go on, you see more of the orange reproducing. offspring, and the green ones not so much. And then you get to the end, and suddenly all the green ones have been eaten over the course of a handful of generations, by those birds now. So now it's 100% the orange bugs in that population. Now, maybe a new predator comes into that area and loves the orange ones, who knows. But this, like I said, is a very good example. It's kind of just showing you one really simple scenario, one simple trait, and kind of showing you how this can work. But also imagine, like I said, evolution is a very simple thing to understand, but it's very layered, right? So this is an example of just one scenario, one trait, very simple, right? But of course, we have multiple traits as humans, as bugs, as birds, whatever, that forces are acting on, different forces of evolution, and they can be conflicting sometimes. I think I'll give you guys a few examples at some point, but just kind of keep that in mind. 22, slide 22. The next one is mutation. That's another force of evolution. So this is another way that you get a change in allele frequency in a population over time, or that change in genetic information is there's a mutation. So when we talk about things like, mitosis and meiosis, reproduction, we're kind of imagining this is what happens when nothing goes wrong, right? But things go wrong all the time. And so you could have a mutation that is very low level, maybe at the DNA level, there's like a sugar or phosphate, like whatever, that doesn't quite match up the way it's supposed to. And depending on where it is in your DNA, it never really phenotypically matters, something like that. Or it could be that there is a change to who you are. Maybe you end up with a weird mole or something, right? It could be something kind of just neutral. It doesn't really affect your ability to reproduce necessarily. But it could be at the level of like an entire gene. Maybe it gets turned on or is something new or gets deleted, so then there might be an actual true change to you that could maybe be beneficial, or it could be detrimental. It just depends on what it is, right? And then, of course, there could be like at the level of maybe the entire chromosome is deleted, or you have an extra chromosome, right? So multiple levels to how this can happen, and multiple results. It could result in something that's neutral, doesn't really matter. It could result in something that is really beneficial, and it could result in something that's like really detrimental. So I think, if I'm remembering correctly, I'm trying to think if I gave this example to you guys in another lecture. Maybe I did, but a really good example, well, I might have to get a new, more modern example, but there was this movie that came out years ago. I think it's actually on Netflix now. It's called Waterworld. Basically, the premise of the movie is the polar ice caps have melted, and basically there's no land left, and so those humans who have survived are living on like boats and ships and whatnot. And the main character kind of shows at the very beginning that he has webbed toes, and this kind of helps him get into the water more easily. He can maneuver better, be faster to catch like his food, right? So let's say you have webbed toes now in this current environment in like Las Vegas 2026, that's kind of neutral, right? It's not really affecting you positively or negatively in terms of reproduction, right? Or, mating or anything like that. It's just kind of neutral. But if, let's say, suddenly there was a bunch of, water covering the whole earth, having that would then be beneficial, right? So it's always, like I said, looking at the trait, the genetics, behavioral, physical trait, and the environment, because that's going to tell you whether that trait ends up being neutral, beneficial, or detrimental. So mutations there's also more than one type. So the one I just described to you is called spontaneous, but there's also one that's called induced, like a human-made mutation. So like, say you are exposed to radiation, like on accident or on purpose, this can cause there to be, mutations in your body. That can happen. So we do, like if you are pregnant, you have to make sure you're not exposed to like high amounts of radiation with maybe getting certain scans done or flying in the air. A lot of that now is like decreased in its like being problematic, but some of that's still there, so we're kind of more aware of that. So obviously, if you're someone who works as like an X-ray technician, you have to be much more protective of your body because you're getting that exposure. You're around it every day versus you going in for an X-ray, once every 10 years or something. It's fine. So that could also cause, The next one, slide 24, is called gene flow. Now, The image there, it's a single image, it's pretty simple. And this one is very simple idea, gene flow. Basically, the concept of gene flow, because remember, evolution is just the change in genetic information in a population over time, right? Which could be 100 generations, it could be 2 generations. That part doesn't matter. So let's say you're a group of whatever animal, doesn't matter. And as per this image here, some of you are red and some of you are blue. Let's say in the beginning it's 50-50. Let's say then some of the population decides, like, we don't like it here anymore. We're going to leave. We're going to go somewhere else. We're going to be part of a different population. And let's say it happens to be, all blue people. And so what used to maybe be 50-50 in that population is now 60-40, and there are more reds. You have a change in the genetic information of that population, not because of a genetic mutation, not because of a natural selection, but simply because some individuals decided to leave. So it changes the genetic makeup of that group, right? Similarly, let's say you were a population of red and blue individuals and it's 50-50, but here comes along these other individuals and they want to be in your group. They're like, we traveled far, we want to be in your population, in your group, and they all happen to be red people or red whatever. And so now what used to be 50-50 is now 70-30, mostly red, simply because new individuals joined that particular group. Does that make sense, right? So this one's, don't overthink this one. It's very, very simple. Either individuals are leaving or individuals are coming in. Whether it's a human or a frog or a rabbit, whatever, it doesn't matter. The next one is genetic drift. This one, there are a few different examples. This one I feel like this one's one of my favorites. It's very interesting. In fact, a lot of my research focuses on, natural selection and genetic drift. So genetic drift, let me give you a really good example would be, because we kind of call this one more like by chance. It's also named neutral evolution. So I'll explain why. So here's the scenario. Let's say you're living on an island. It's a beautiful day. You and your friends have decided to go down to the beach and play some volleyball down at the beach. And just by random chance, all of you are blonde. Let's say there's like 5 of you. You're all blonde or whatever. You'll have round noses, whatever the trait is, right? Just by random chance. And then there's another group of friends, and they have seen this beautiful sunny day and decided they're going to go on the hillside and have a picnic and open a bottle of wine or whatever, And just by random chance, that group happens to be all, brunettes, or have pointy noses or whatever the trait is, right? Now, let's say a tsunami comes and crashes into the island. Just by wrong place, wrong time, the people who are more likely to survive are going to be the people on the hillside, not the people on the beach, right? And simply because, random chance, wrong place, wrong time, that population, let's say, used to be 50% brunette or pointy nose or whatever, and 50% blonde. Now, because let's say a big portion of the blonde population is now gone, now that population is mostly brunette or mostly pointy nose or whatever the trait is, right? Not because of a mutation, not because of people leaving or coming in, like migrating in, but because of oftentimes a natural disaster, something like that, it drastically changes the genetic population of that group, right? So you have a change in my brain, you have a genetic change in that population over time, but because of something, like wrong place, wrong time, random chance, natural disaster, something like that. And like I mentioned, genetic drift is also known as neutral evolution, and this is why. So sometimes when we as scientists look at the past, and as a paleoanthropologist, this is one of those things when looking at Neanderthals for many decades, people were confused on. Because Neanderthals, which we'll talk about later, they have some very, very unique facial and skull traits, very unique. And people love to do this. They love to jump on the natural selection. It must be natural selection. It's everyone's favorite, even though there are 4 other forces, right? And so everyone's like, well, they have this very unique environment, Ice Age, mountainous Europe, all of these unique features, really to their whole body, must be because of that environment. Now, with some of them, you're like, okay, yeah, the natural selection story is probably the correct one, but others don't fit that. As an example, Neanderthals have very, very large nasal openings, and so their noses would have been very large. And if you didn't really know anything about anything, you might think, oh, well, that maybe is an adaptation to cold weather, like how they had to breathe or something, right? But when you actually look at mammals who live in cold populations, their nasal openings actually tend to be small. And mammals who live in warm environments tend to have large nasal openings. So then it's like, okay, that doesn't quite fit with natural selection. And many of the traits, that was the experience. And so you're like, well, what are the other forces of evolution? So now most paleoanthropologists, myself included, we are pretty sure, that genetic drift is what's going on, because you can have, this is why it's, sorry, kind of a preface, but this is why it's called neutral evolution, is if in whatever the example of the Neanderthals or the example of the people on the island, you might have a trait that is really prominent suddenly, maybe because of the natural disaster or because Neanderthals got isolated into a certain area and weren't interbreeding with anything else or whatever. And let's say with those Neanderthals, everyone in that original population has a large nasal or has a medium to large nasal opening just by random chance, whatever. As they continue to interbreed with each other, they're going to keep passing that same trait down. Just like the people on the island, if let's say most of the blondes got wiped out and then all over the course of time, brunettes are getting together and having kids, you're barring any kind of like mutation or something, you're going to just continue to see mostly brunettes, right? So if you were taking a snapshot of that population, you might say, wow, everyone on this island is a brunette. Maybe being brunette is really beneficial. They're going to think of like a natural selection, explanation. But in reality, that's not it at all. Being a brunette is kind of neutral. It's not affecting them in any way on that island. It doesn't help them, doesn't hurt them. It's neutral, right? It's only prominent because that's just what was there in the genetics of everyone after that event. Does that make sense, right? So you might see a trait be very prominent in the population, but it's not necessarily because it's super beneficial. It could just be that it's neutral. And if something's detrimental, natural selection will act on it to like get rid of it. But if it's just neutral, it can just be there. It's not hurting or helping anything. So you might see what particular trait, brown hair, whatever, big nasal openings, is just there in prominence because that's just what everyone had, So that's genetic drift. There's some other examples like I've kind of described like the founder effect or the bottleneck effect. Like the island example would be like the bottleneck effect. I think I have a picture. Oh, never mind, I misspoke. Oh, I think there's a small image there where basically, let's say you have a bottle, and in that bottle you've got a bunch of marbles, and there's like red marbles, purple marbles. Sorry, I got like a hair itching me. Green marbles, pink marbles, whatever. That's kind of showing the variation of that population, and then you have some kind of an event, natural disaster, something like that. And so you can only pour a few of those marbles out of the bottle, right? Because it's got a small neck versus the bottle itself might be large and in its body, and maybe only a pink and a green marble drop out. So that's kind of like a visual representation of like a natural disaster. You could have a lot of variation, but because of some crazy event, whoever's left, it's only like a small example of that original population. And then everything from there is going to end up being like from that new, basically starter population. So moving on. Oh, yeah. Oh, so I explained that on the next slide, like what neutral evolution is. And then the last one is non-random mating, aka sexual selection. Now, because this one is very involved and always very interesting to talk about, we actually have a whole entire lecture dedicated to just this one force of evolution. So here's just kind of introductory information, basically, that there are reasons why we pick the mates we do, whether you're a human or a rabbit or a frog or whatever. It's not random. It's not just, oh, whatever. If I were to ask all of you, like, make a list of, your top 5 traits in like a perfect mate. Probably some of them are going to be, physical traits. Some might be behavioral. Like, oh, I love someone with an athletic build, and I want them to be really into like, I don't know, like, I love someone with an athletic build, and I want them to be really into like, I don't know, like, I love someone with an athletic build, and I want them to be really into like, I don't know, like, I love someone with an athletic build, and I want them to be really into like, I don't know, like, I love someone with an athletic build, and I want them to be really into like, I don't know, like, I love someone with an athletic build, and I want them to be really into like, I don't know, like, I love someone with an athletic build, and I want them to be really into like, I don't know, like, I love someone with an athletic build, and I want them to be really into like, I don't know, like, I love someone with an athletic build, and I want them to be really into like, I don't know, like, I love someone with an athletic build, and I want them to be really into like, I don't know, like, I love someone with an athletic build, and I want them to be really into like, I don't know, like, I love someone with an athletic build, and I want them to be really into like, I don't know, like, I love someone with an athletic binging movie or whatever, you might have some traits, like I said, are behavioral, some that are physical, and everyone's going to have something a little bit different, right? You're going to see some general overlap. Like if you were to look at all females or all males, you might see some general similarities because that's just how sexual selection works. Like we're a sexually reproducing species, so there's going to be some general trends. But at the individual level, you're going to see some differences, right? And most of that's going to be based on evolution. Some of it maybe not. Like as an example, let's say you dated someone who was a blonde and they were just like, they treated you really poorly. You might think, I'll never date a blonde again, something like that. That's not necessarily evolution. But the majority of it is. So like I said, we're going to talk about that in much more detail on the entire lecture dedicated to that. So that is it for this one. Yeah, that's pretty much it. So we'll see you guys on the next one.